Okay, my friends, so what you're looking at here is actually an Excel simulator because there's no way we could generate enough data quickly enough to analyze this question for this exam. So what we've got is we're going to do the first experiment, which is how many cards do you have to deal out until you get a repeated suit. Now, we talked about in class the least number is 2 and the greatest number is 5. The two columns C and D are showing what happens if we deal from a fresh deck versus a recycled deck. A recycled deck means you don't put the cards back in, you just keep going. So like, remember in the video, the first time I did the experiment, I dealt out 3 cards and then I put those back in and shuffled again. What happens if you don't? So right now, every time I press the F9 button, you're going to see the numbers change in the fresh deck counts and the recycled deck counts. Now, there's a couple things you're going to notice. First of all, the fresh deck count sum down here only goes up by 1. And the reason for that is pretty straightforward. Let's zoom in on just the fresh decks here. If I'm using a fresh deck every time and I do the trial, I'm done after I get a repeat. So right now, it took 3 cards because the number that was 4 became 5. That took 5 cards. That took 3 cards. That took 4 cards. That took 4, and so forth and so on. That's the fresh deck. That's the way I had you doing it in class before I noticed what Logan had done with recycling the decks. And now let's look over here. You'll notice that when I deal the recycled deck, the sums change by a lot more. Hopefully that makes sense. I can do more than one trial on a recycled deck. Like, it's hard to kind of keep track. I'm going to hit F9 and then look. Yeah, we got some 2s, some 3s, some 4s, and some 5s. And it looks like we're usually getting, oh, something didn't change. It's really hard to look at, which is why I created the spreadsheet to do it for me. So what I got here is I can just hold the F9 button down and let this thing just generate data all day long. Now, what I want to talk about is let's just stop for a second. This is going to create a problem necessarily, isn't it? Because you're always going to have more trials on the recycled deck than on the fresh deck. So what I chose to do instead, well, in addition, was to look at the fresh and recycled deck percentages. So for example, you'll notice right now, let's change these to actual percentages and not decimals so it's a little bit easier to look at. You'll notice that there are slight differences between the fresh deck and the recycled deck. There's a 1% difference here, roughly. 3% difference here, 5% difference here, 1% difference here. They sum up to 100%, which hopefully makes sense. But now the question I have is, there's a difference between those two decks percentages, right? 22, 23, 1%, 34, 37, 3, and so forth and so on. My question is that meaningful? Is it meaningful, or is it just due to randomness? And we have the tools to deal with that. Let's look at that next.